The notification for the family group chat pinged on my phone at 7:43 p.m. on a Saturday evening. I was deep into reviewing quarterly reports for Hayes Enterprises, my investment holding company. The cheerful chime was a stark contrast to the gut punch waiting for me when I opened the message. Heads up, everyone. For the cookout tomorrow, Eli, please don't bother coming. You'll just bring down the whole vibe, honestly. T. Thompson. Tiffany Thompson, my daughter-in-law of 2 years, had just publicly disinvited me from my own son's family gathering. But what made my chest tighten with searing humiliation wasn't just her casual cruelty. It was watching the likes roll in one by one. Linda Thompson, Tiffany's mother. Derek Thompson Sr., Tiffany's father. And then, my own son, Robert Hayes, added his approval, publicly endorsing his wife's message that I was nothing more than a mood-ruining inconvenience. I stared at my phone for several minutes, watching those little heart and laughing emojis burn into my retina. 29 years of raising Robbie as a single father after his mother, Deborah, died. 29 years of being his unwavering supporter, his confidant, and his biggest cheerleader through every triumph and every setback. And now, he was publicly confirming his wife's assessment that my mere presence would ruin their family gathering. I typed and deleted a dozen drafts. Explanations of how I'd never intentionally ruined their events. Reminders of the times I'd stepped in financially when Tiffany's meager car sales weren't enough to cover their mortgage payments. Questions about when I'd become such a burden that my own family preferred I stay away. Instead, I wrote 4 simple words. Understood. Enjoy your cookout. But as I set my phone aside and returned to my laptop, a different kind of understanding began to crystallize in my mind. Tiffany Thompson had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Not because she'd successfully wounded me, though she had, but because she'd severely underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. You see, Tiffany had absolutely no idea that 6 months ago I had quietly executed the acquisition of the failing automotive dealership where she was employed. Thompson Auto Group had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years, and the previous owner had been desperate to sell before filing for bankruptcy. Hayes Enterprises, my holding company, had purchased the entire operation for considerably less than its market value, with clear plans to restructure and revitalize the business. My disrespectful daughter-in-law, Tiffany Thompson, had been unknowingly working directly for me since March. The irony was delectable, but what made it even sweeter was her complete ignorance of her precarious position. She'd spent the last 6 months bragging to Robbie about her new job opportunities and impressing management at Thompson Auto Group, completely unaware that her detailed performance reviews crossed my desk every month. And those reviews painted a picture of an employee who was, frankly, failing at every measurable metric. Consistently low sales numbers, multiple severe customer complaints, unprofessional behavior toward male colleagues, and a chronic tendency to blame external factors rather than take responsibility for her poor performance. Tiffany Thompson was exactly the kind of liability that smart business owners eliminate quickly before they can damage company culture and reputation. I'd been planning to address her employment status gradually, perhaps through a formal performance improvement plan, followed by a gentle transition out of the company. But Tiffany's little group chat stunt had just accelerated my timeline considerably. I opened my laptop and navigated to the employee files for Thompson Auto Group. Tiffany's personnel folder contained 6 months of documentation that would make tomorrow's conversation very interesting indeed. Sales performance. Bottom 10% of the sales team consistently. Customer feedback. 23% satisfaction rating. Company average. 87%. Colleague reviews. Multiple complaints about inappropriate and condescending comments toward male staff members. Attendance. 14 unexcused absences in 6 months. Professional development. Declined to participate in required sales training programs. But it was the most recent incident report that sealed Tiffany's fate. Last week, she had apparently told a male customer that he didn't understand enough about cars to make big financial decisions, and suggested he bring his wife back to handle the real negotiation. The customer had filed a formal complaint and taken his high-value business to a competitor. In Tiffany's mind, she was probably sitting in her living room right now, congratulating herself on putting her difficult father-in-law in his place. She'd successfully established that I was unwelcome at family gatherings, demonstrated her authority in front of her husband and parents, and marked her territory like the alpha female she fancied herself to be. What Tiffany didn't know was that tomorrow morning, she had a mandatory meeting scheduled with the chief executive officer of Thompson Auto Group to discuss her future with the company. The appointment had been on her calendar for 3 days, set up by my assistant under the guise of a routine performance review with upper management. Tiffany had never met the mysterious CEO who'd taken over the company 6 months earlier. All internal employee communications came through the general manager, and I deliberately maintained a low profile during the transition period. As far as Tiffany knew, her new boss was some anonymous corporate executive who cared only about numbers and bottom lines. She was about to discover how spectacularly wrong she was. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing Tiffany's employment file in minute detail, not because I needed additional justification for what was about to happen, but because I wanted to be absolutely thorough in my approach. When Tiffany Thompson walked into my office tomorrow morning, I wanted to have every fact, every figure, and every documented instance of her professional inadequacy laid out with surgical precision. But this wasn't just about revenge, though I'll admit a component of my motivation was certainly punitive. This was about establishing boundaries and consequences for behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Tiffany had spent 2 years systematically undermining my relationship with Robbie, creating artificial conflicts and positioning herself as the reasonable voice protecting her husband from his overbearing father. She'd convinced Robbie that my success as a businessman somehow diminished his autonomy as a married man. She'd framed my offers to help financially as attempts to control their decisions. She'd recast my presence at family events as an intrusion rather than inclusion. And apparently, she'd succeeded so completely that my own son now viewed me as someone who would ruin their gatherings simply by existing in the same space. Well, Tiffany Thompson was about to learn that actions have consequences, that humiliating powerful men in public requires a level of confidence that should be backed up by actual power, and that sometimes the father-in-law you dismiss as a nuisance might just be the person who signs your paychecks. My phone buzzed with a text from Robbie. "Dad, I hope you're not upset about tomorrow. Tiffany just thinks smaller gatherings work better for family bonding." I stared at the message, marveling at how completely Tiffany had rewritten the narrative. My exclusion wasn't cruelty. It was family optimization. My absence wasn't rejection. It was strategic guest list management. I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. I hope you all have a wonderful time," because tomorrow morning, Tiffany Thompson would discover that her definition of family bonding was about to undergo a dramatic revision. Some lessons, I was about to demonstrate, were best delivered with the full authority of a corner office and a carefully documented paper trail. And some fathers-in-law were considerably more powerful than the women who underestimated them. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed fitting for what I had planned. I arrived at Thompson Auto Group at 8:30 a.m., a full hour before Tiffany's scheduled appointment, to review her termination paperwork one final time and ensure everything was legally airtight. The dealership was quiet on weekends, with only security and a skeleton maintenance crew on duty. I let myself into the executive offices with my key card and settled behind the mahogany desk in the CEO's corner office that Tiffany had never seen before. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. While Tiffany was probably waking up in the house that I'd co-signed the mortgage for, preparing for a cookout at her parents' house that she'd banned me from attending, she had no idea that her professional life was about to collide spectacularly with her personal cruelty. I'd spent 5 years building Hayes Enterprises into a multi-million-dollar enterprise after my wife Deborah died, transforming my grief into determination and my marketing background into a diversified business portfolio. Thompson Auto Group was my latest acquisition, purchased not for sentimental reasons, but because struggling automotive dealerships represented excellent turnaround opportunities when managed properly. The previous owner, Richard Thompson, no relation to Tiffany, despite the surname coincidence, had been hemorrhaging money through poor management, outdated sales practices, and a toxic workplace culture that drove away both customers and quality employees. I'd bought the business with plans to modernize operations, implement new training programs, and establish zero-tolerance policies for the kind of unprofessional behavior that had been damaging the company's reputation. Tiffany Thompson had been hired 3 months before my acquisition, during the final death throes of Richard Thompson's mismanagement. She'd somehow convinced Robbie that landing a job at Thompson Auto Group represented a significant career advancement when, in reality, she'd joined a sinking ship that was hiring anyone desperate enough to work on commission in an increasingly hostile environment. What Tiffany didn't know, and what I discovered through employee interviews during the transition, was that her hiring had been a source of complaint among the existing male staff members from her very first week. Multiple men had reported inappropriate comments, condescending behavior, and a general attitude that suggested she viewed male colleagues and customers as inherently less knowledgeable about automotive matters. At 9:25 a.m., I heard voices in the outer office. Tiffany had arrived early for her 9:30 appointment, accompanied by Robbie, whom she'd apparently brought along to show off her workplace and impress him with her professional environment. The addition of my son to this morning's revelation would complicate matters emotionally, but it might also help Robbie understand exactly what kind of woman he'd married. I could hear Tiffany speaking to my executive assistant, Sam, through the open door. "Yes, I'm Tiffany Thompson, here for the meeting with the CEO. I brought my husband Robbie to show him the operation here. Pretty impressive setup we've got." Sam's voice was carefully neutral. "Of course, Miss Thompson. Mr. Hayes is ready for you. Please go ahead into his office." "Mr. Hayes? I thought the CEO was a white man." "No, ma'am. Elijah Hayes has been CEO since the acquisition in March." I heard Tiffany's footsteps pause outside my door, probably processing this information and wondering why she'd assumed the CEO was white when she'd never actually met the person. Then the footsteps resumed, accompanied by the click of Robbie's loafers on the polished floor. "Honey, I didn't realize the new CEO was black," Tiffany murmured to Robbie, loud enough for me to hear through the slightly ajar door. "I mean, it explains some of the micromanagement and unnecessary policy changes around here. Black men in leadership always have something to prove." I almost smiled at the perfect setup Tiffany was providing for her own downfall. In 30 seconds, she was about to discover exactly which black man in a leadership position had been micromanaging her employment situation for the past 6 months. "Come in," I called, my voice carrying the professional authority I'd cultivated over years of running successful businesses. Tiffany pushed open the door and stepped confidently into my office, her chest puffed out with the importance of a woman about to impress her husband by showing off her workplace achievements. Robbie followed a step behind, looking around the spacious corner office with mild curiosity. Then they both saw me sitting behind the executive desk, and their expressions shifted from confidence to confusion to absolute shock in the span of 3 seconds. "Dad," Robbie's voice was barely above a whisper. Tiffany's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no sound emerging as her brain struggled to process what her eyes were telling her. "Good morning," I said calmly, gesturing toward the 2 chairs positioned in front of my desk. "Please have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." "Eli, what are you doing here?" Tiffany finally managed, her voice higher pitched than usual. "I work here, Tiffany. I own this company. I've been your employer for the past 6 months." I opened the folder containing her employment records and performance reviews. "Which brings us to why you're here this morning." Robbie sank into his chair, his face pale as he tried to reconcile his understanding of his father's business activities with the reality of finding me in the CEO's chair of his wife's workplace. Tiffany remained standing, her face flushing red as the implications of my revelation began to sink in. "You bought Thompson Auto Group 6 months ago?" "Yes. Through Hayes Enterprises, which is my investment company. I've been reviewing employee performance as part of our restructuring process, and I'm afraid your numbers are quite concerning." "Eli, you can't be serious. This is completely inappropriate. You're my father-in-law. There are conflict of interest issues here." "On the contrary, Tiffany, the conflict of interest would be if I allowed family relationships to excuse documented poor job performance and inappropriate workplace behavior, which is exactly what I'm not going to do." I spread Tiffany's performance reviews across the desk where both she and Robbie could see them. 6 months of documented failure, customer complaints, and colleague concerns laid out with bureaucratic precision. "Your sales numbers place you in the bottom 10% of our team consistently. You have a 23% customer satisfaction rating compared to our company average of 87%. You've received multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior toward male colleagues and customers." Robbie leaned forward to read the documents, his expression growing more concerned as he processed the extent of Tiffany's professional inadequacies. "These can't be accurate," Tiffany protested. "I've been one of the stronger performers here. Management has been very impressed with my—" "Tiffany, I am management. I review every performance metric personally. I read every customer complaint. I approve every personnel decision. I pulled out the incident report from last week, including this complaint from Mr. Charles Morrison. who filed a formal grievance after you told him he didn't understand enough about cars to make financial decisions and suggested he bring his wife back for the real negotiation. That was a misunderstanding. He was clearly overwhelmed by the technical specifications. He was a mechanical engineer with 25 years of experience in automotive manufacturing, Tiffany. He bought his car from our competitor and specifically mentioned your condescending attitude in his review on 3 separate platforms. Robbie was staring at Tiffany with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, discovering that his girlfriend had been lying to him about seeing other girls. Tiffany, you told me that customer loved working with you. You said he praised your expertise. Robbie, I can explain. No, I interrupted, maintaining my professional tone despite the personal satisfaction I was experiencing. What Tiffany needs to understand is that her employment with Thompson Auto Group is being terminated, effective immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Tiffany's face went from red to white in an instant, while Robbie's mouth fell open in shock. You can't fire me for personal reasons, Tiffany said, her voice desperate. Now, this is retaliation for family disagreements. This is termination for cause based on documented poor performance, customer complaints, and violation of company policies regarding professional conduct. I slid the official termination letter across the desk. Everything is documented according to employment law requirements. You'll find that your severance package includes continuation of health benefits for 30 days and payment for unused vacation time. Eli, this is insane. You can't destroy my career because you're upset about a family cookout. I looked at Tiffany Thompson, the woman who'd spent 2 years systematically undermining my relationship with my son, who just yesterday humiliated me in front of her family, who'd consistently underestimated the man she dismissed as a controlling father-in-law. Tiffany, your career isn't being destroyed because of a cookout. It's being destroyed because you're bad at your job and you treat people poorly. The cookout simply provided clarity about your character that confirmed what your work performance had already demonstrated. Some reckonings, I was learning, were worth waiting for, and some people needed to discover that their actions had consequences they'd never anticipated. The silence that followed my announcement stretched for nearly 30 seconds, broken only by the distant sound of weekend traffic and Tiffany's increasingly labored breathing. I watched her process the reality of her situation. The woman who'd confidently dismissed her father-in-law from a family gathering was now facing unemployment delivered by that same father-in-law from behind a CEO's desk. This can't be legal, Tiffany finally said, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. You can't fire someone because of personal family issues. I'll contact an employment attorney. Please do, I replied calmly, sliding another document across the desk. Here's a complete record of your performance reviews, customer complaints, and documented policy violations over the past 6 months. Any employment attorney will tell you this termination is not only legal, but long overdue. Robbie picked up the termination letter, reading it with the careful attention he'd always given to important documents. As a college graduate with a business degree, he understood exactly what he was seeing. Tiffany, these performance metrics, they're terrible. Your sales numbers are consistently below minimum standards. Robbie, don't let him manipulate you. This is clearly a setup. He's been planning this since he bought the company, probably waiting for an excuse to get revenge on me. Revenge for what? I asked, genuinely curious about Tiffany's perspective on our relationship. For challenging your control over Robbie, for setting healthy boundaries in our marriage, for refusing to let you manipulate our family decisions with your money and your business connections. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized how completely Tiffany had rewritten the narrative of our relationship in her mind. In her version of events, I was the controlling villain, and she was the heroic wife, protecting her husband from his overbearing father. Eli, can you give me a specific example of how I've tried to control Robbie's decisions? Are you kidding? The constant offers to pay for things we can handle ourselves, the suggestions about Robbie's career, the way you insert yourself into conversations about our financial planning. You mean the times I offered to help with your mortgage when you were 3 months behind on payments? The career advice Robbie specifically asked for when he was considering job offers? The financial planning conversations that happened because you asked for my input on investment strategies? Tiffany's face flushed a deeper red. That's not how it happened. Actually, Tiffany, that's exactly how it happened. Robbie's voice was quiet but firm. Dad has never offered unsolicited help or advice. I've asked for his input on every major decision because he's successful and experienced. Tiffany, you're letting him rewrite history. No, Tiffany, I think you're the one who's been rewriting history. Robbie turned to look at his wife with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time. I've been thinking about this for months, actually. The way you react whenever I mention Dad's advice, or when I want to spend time with him, or when he offers to help us. Tiffany, you told me Dad was being controlling when he offered to co-sign our mortgage, but we needed that co-signature to qualify for the loan. You said he was interfering when he suggested I apply for the marketing position at Henderson & Associates, but that job increased my salary by 40%. You complained that he was inserting himself into our financial planning, but you were the one who asked him to review our investment portfolio. Tiffany looked between Robbie and me with growing panic, apparently realizing that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. You're missing the bigger picture here. What bigger picture? Robbie said. The picture where my successful, supportive father is somehow the villain in our marriage? The picture where asking for help from family is manipulation? Or the picture where you've been lying to me about your job performance while complaining that Dad doesn't respect your professional achievements? Tiffany, you didn't even know who owned the company until 10 minutes ago. How could you have been dealing with demanding management when you'd never met the CEO? The general manager has been implementing policies. The general manager has been implementing my policies, I interjected. Policies designed to improve customer service, increase sales performance, and eliminate workplace harassment. The fact that you experience those policies as demanding says more about your work habits than it does about management expectations. Robbie was reading through Tiffany's performance reviews with increasing disbelief. Tiffany, this customer complaint says you told a man he should let the women handle the car buying decision. Another one says, you implied a male customer was too emotional to make rational financial choices about vehicle purchases. Those customers were clearly overwhelmed by technical information. Tiffany, stop. Robbie's voice cut through her explanation with finality. Just stop. These aren't misunderstandings or overwhelmed customers. This is a pattern of behavior that I'm recognizing from our own relationship. I watched my son connect dots that had probably been forming in his subconscious for months. The way Tiffany dismissed his opinions about financial decisions. The way she explained away his concerns about her behavior toward other men. The way she positioned herself as the rational voice, protecting him from external influences, including his own father. Tiffany, you're being manipulated right now. Can't you see that? Your father orchestrated this entire situation to drive a wedge between us. I orchestrated nothing, Tiffany. I bought a failing business 6 months ago as an investment opportunity. You happened to work there. Your poor performance and inappropriate behavior happened to make you eligible for termination. Your decision to humiliate me publicly yesterday happened to accelerate my timeline. So, you're admitting this is retaliation. I'm admitting that yesterday's group chat message clarified something important about your character that your work performance had already suggested, that you have fundamental issues with respecting men, especially men in positions of authority or independence. Robbie sat down the performance reviews and looked at Tiffany with an expression that was part disappointment and part recognition. Tiffany, how long have you been lying to me about your job performance? I haven't been lying. I've been dealing with unfair management and unrealistic expectations. These reviews go back 6 months. 6 months of consistently poor performance, customer complaints, and workplace issues. How long have you been telling me that management was impressed with your work and considering you for promotions? Tiffany's silence provided Robbie with the answer he needed. 6 months, Robbie said quietly. You've been lying to me for 6 months about how well you were doing at work while complaining that Dad doesn't respect your professional success. Robbie, I was protecting you from unnecessary stress. You were lying to me about your professional failures while simultaneously isolating me from the one person who could have helped us navigate financial difficulties if your job situation became problematic. I felt a surge of pride watching Robbie analyze the situation with the clear thinking that had made him successful in his own career. Tiffany's manipulation tactics were becoming visible to him, and he was responding with the intelligence and strength I'd raised him to possess. Dad, Robbie said, turning to me with an expression that was part apology and part realization. I owe you an enormous apology, not just for the group chat yesterday, but for months of allowing Tiffany to convince me that your support was somehow problematic. Robbie, you don't need to apologize for being loyal to your wife. You need to decide whether your wife has been worthy of that loyalty. Tiffany stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and desperation. This is unbelievable. You've turned my husband against me using your business position to manipulate the situation. Tiffany, I've provided documentation of your work performance and allowed you and Robbie to draw your own conclusions. The fact that those conclusions are unfavorable to you isn't manipulation. It's accountability. Some truths, I was learning, required the right setting to be fully revealed, and some marriages were built on foundations that couldn't survive transparency about character, competence, and respect. Tiffany was about to discover which category her marriage fell into. Tiffany stared at Robbie and me for another moment, her face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. Anger, disbelief, panic, and finally, a calculating coldness that I'd never seen from her before. "Fine," she said, her voice taking on a bitter edge. "If this is how you want to play it, Eli, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are, using your business position to destroy your daughter-in-law's career because she wouldn't let you control his marriage." "Tiffany, that's not what happened here," Robbie said firmly. "You were failing at your job long before yesterday's group chat. Robbie, he's manipulated this entire situation. He probably bought this company specifically to have power over me." I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer narcissism of Tiffany's assumption. "Tiffany, I bought Thompson Auto Group because it was a profitable investment opportunity. You represent less than 1% of this company's employees, and until yesterday, your existence was barely a footnote in my business planning." "Right, and I'm supposed to believe that. You're supposed to believe documented evidence and objective performance metrics. But Tiffany, what you believe isn't really relevant anymore because your employment here is terminated regardless of your opinions about my motivations." Tiffany gathered up the termination papers with sharp, angry movements, her professional composure completely abandoned now that her audience was family rather than potential car buyers. "This won't stand. I'll file complaints with the labor board, contact employment attorneys, and make sure everyone knows that Hayes Enterprises engages in illegal retaliation against employees." "Please do," I replied. "I'm confident that any investigation will confirm that your termination was based solely on performance issues and documented policy violations." "We'll see about that." Tiffany turned to Robbie with desperation creeping back into her voice. "Robbie, you can't seriously be taking his side in this. He just destroyed my career out of spite." "Tiffany, he didn't destroy your career. Your work performance destroyed your career. Dad just documented it and made the business decision that any competent CEO would make after you deliberately humiliated me at a family cookout that he wasn't even invited to. That I wasn't invited to because you publicly uninvited me in a group chat where you said I would ruin the whole party. Tiffany, you humiliated yourself." Robbie stood up, smoothing his shirt with the kind of decisive movement that indicated he'd reached a conclusion about something important. "Tiffany, I think we need to go home and have a serious conversation about our marriage." "Tiffany, you can't be serious. You're going to let your father's business vendetta destroy our relationship?" "I'm going to reevaluate a relationship with someone who's been lying to me about her job performance for 6 months while systematically undermining my relationship with my father." Robbie's voice was calm, but final. "Tiffany, I've been making excuses for your behavior and your attitudes for 2 years, convincing myself that your issues with Dad were about boundaries rather than control." "That's exactly what they were about." "No, they weren't. They were about your discomfort with successful men and your need to be the dominant voice in any relationship, even when your opinions aren't supported by facts or expertise." I watched Tiffany's face as she realized that Robbie was not only seeing through her manipulation tactics but articulating them with clarity that suggested he'd been thinking about this for longer than today's revelation. "Tiffany, I've never tried to control you. You've spent 2 years convincing me that my father's support was actually interference. You've dismissed his business advice, even when that advice proved profitable. You've complained about his controlling behavior while lying about your own professional competence and undermining my confidence in my own judgment. That's not how I intended it. Tiffany, I don't care how you intended it. I care about the actual impact of your behavior on my life and my relationships." Tiffany looked between Robbie and me with growing desperation, apparently realizing that her usual tactics weren't working in this environment where her professional failures were documented and her personal manipulations were being examined in clear light. "Eli, if you think firing me will solve whatever issues you have with our family dynamics, you're wrong. This will only create more problems." "Tiffany, I don't have issues with family dynamics. I have issues with being publicly disrespected by someone whose career I could destroy with a phone call, which, as it turns out, I just did. You're admitting that this was personal retaliation." I'm admitting that personal disrespect from a professional subordinate tends to clarify business decisions about that subordinate's continued employment. Robbie moved toward the door, his body language indicating that he considered this meeting concluded. Tiffany, we're going home. You need to clean out your desk and return company property, and we need to discuss what happens next in our marriage. Robbie, please don't make any hasty decisions based on your father's manipulation of this situation. Robbie stopped and turned back to Tiffany with an expression that reminded me of his mother, patient but firm, the look of someone who'd reached the end of their tolerance for nonsense. Tiffany, Dad didn't manipulate this situation. You created this situation by performing poorly at work while lying about it, by treating men inappropriately in professional settings, and by publicly humiliating the one person who supported our family financially when we needed help. I never asked for his financial support because I handled all the conversations about the mortgage co-signing, the emergency loan when your car needed repairs, and the down payment assistance when we bought our house. Tiffany, you've been benefiting from Dad's generosity while complaining about his interference for 2 years. I felt a mixture of pride and sadness watching Robbie articulate truths that Tiffany had apparently convinced him to doubt or ignore throughout their marriage. My son was stronger and smarter than Tiffany had given him credit for, but he'd been generous enough to make excuses for her behavior until her professional failures made her character impossible to rationalize away. Mr. Hayes, Tiffany said, her voice taking on a formal tone as she apparently recognized that her family-based appeals weren't working. I'll be consulting with attorneys about wrongful termination and workplace retaliation. This isn't over. Tiffany, this conversation is definitely over. Security will escort you to your desk to collect personal belongings, and your access cards and company phone will be deactivated immediately. You can't prevent me from seeking legal recourse. I'm not preventing anything. I'm informing you that Thompson Auto Group takes employment law seriously and maintains thorough documentation to support all personnel decisions. Tiffany looked at Robbie one last time, searching for any sign that he might support her against my unreasonable business decision. Robbie, I hope you realize that your father has just demonstrated that he's willing to destroy people who don't submit to his control. No, Tiffany. Dad has just demonstrated that he's willing to hold people accountable for their behavior and performance, even when those people are family members who assume they deserve special treatment. As Tiffany left my office with the kind of stiff dignity that people maintain when they're trying to salvage pride from humiliating circumstances, I realized that Robbie had learned something valuable about the difference between support and control, between family loyalty and enabling poor behavior. Some lessons, I was discovering, required the right combination of professional authority and personal consequences to be fully absorbed. And some daughters-in-law needed to learn that dismissing powerful men had costs that extended far beyond hurt feelings and family tension. Tiffany Thompson was about to discover exactly how expensive her assumptions about male authority were going to be. The drive to Tiffany and Robbie's house 20 minutes later was conducted in tense silence, with Tiffany gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and Robbie staring out the passenger window with the expression of someone re-evaluating fundamental assumptions about his life. I followed them in my own car, not because I'd been invited, but because Robbie had quietly asked me to come with them before we left the dealership. Dad, I think I'm going to need support for this conversation, and I'm realizing that Tiffany has been systematically discouraging me from asking for your help when I needed it. The house that Tiffany and Robbie lived in was a modest, 2-bedroom ranch in a subdivision that had been built 15 years earlier for young families and first-time homeowners. I'd co-signed the mortgage 2 years ago when Tiffany's credit score and employment history hadn't been sufficient to qualify for the loan on their own. At the time, Tiffany had been grudgingly grateful for my assistance, while making it clear that she viewed the co-signing as a temporary necessity rather than a generous family support. Now, as I parked behind Tiffany's car in the driveway, I couldn't help but notice the small details that suggested financial stress Tiffany had been hiding from Robbie. The lawn needed professional attention. The gutters were showing signs of deferred maintenance, and Tiffany's car had a small dent in the rear panel that hadn't been repaired. Inside the house, the tension was immediate and uncomfortable. Tiffany went straight to the kitchen and opened a beer, despite it being barely 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning, while Robbie sat down at their dining room table with the kind of careful control that suggested he was trying to organize his thoughts before speaking. Tiffany, I need you to explain something to me, Robbie said, his voice calm but firm. I need to understand how you've been telling me for 6 months that your job was going well, that management was impressed with your performance, and that you were being considered for promotions, when the documented reality is that you've been failing consistently and facing customer complaints. Tiffany took a long drink from her beer before answering. Robbie, you don't understand the automotive sales industry. Performance metrics don't tell the whole story. Customer complaints often come from people who are upset about pricing or financing issues that have nothing to do with sales performance. Tiffany, one of the complaints specifically documented you telling a customer that he should let the women handle the car buying decision. That's not about pricing or financing. That's about your attitude toward men. That customer was clearly overwhelmed by the technical specifications. Stop. Robbie's interruption was sharp and final. Stop explaining away documented complaints as customer misunderstandings. I've read the reports, Tiffany. Multiple customers, multiple incidents, consistent patterns of inappropriate behavior. I remained silent, recognizing that Robbie needed to navigate this conversation with Tiffany without my input. This wasn't about my conflict with Tiffany anymore. This was about Robbie discovering truths about his wife that he'd been avoiding or rationalizing for months. Robbie, you're letting your father manipulate you into seeing problems that don't exist. He fired me out of spite, and now he's trying to convince you that his vindictive behavior was justified. Robbie, Dad owns the company where you work. He's seen your performance metrics for 6 months. If your performance had been good, would he have fired you just because of yesterday's group chat? Yes, because he's controlling and vindictive, and he can't stand that I won't let her run our marriage. Robbie stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where he'd planted a small vegetable garden that was now showing signs of neglect due to Tiffany's recent financial stress about water bills. Tiffany, I've been thinking about something. In the 2 years we've been married, every time I've wanted to ask Dad for advice or help, you've convinced me that doing so would be enabling his controlling behavior or undermining our independence as a couple. Because that's exactly what it would have been. But Tiffany, Dad has never given unsolicited advice. He's never imposed his opinions on our decisions. He's never used his financial help as leverage to control our choices. Robbie turned back to face Tiffany with growing clarity. I've always had to ask for his input. And when I've asked, his advice has consistently been helpful and accurate. Tiffany, you're rewriting history. No, Tiffany. I'm remembering history accurately for the first time in months. You've been rewriting history to make Dad's support look like interference and his expertise look like controlling behavior. Tiffany finished her beer and opened another one, her movements becoming more agitated as Robbie's analysis became more pointed. Let me ask you something specific, Robbie continued. When Dad suggested I apply for the marketing position at Henderson & Associates, you said he was trying to control my career choices, but that job increased my salary by 40% and gave me the experience I needed to advance professionally. How was that advice controlling rather than helpful? Because he should have trusted us to make our own career decisions without his input. Robbie, I asked for his input because he has 20 years of experience in marketing and business development. Why wouldn't I ask for advice from someone with relevant expertise? Because married couples should be able to make decisions without outside interference. Outside interference? Tiffany? He's my father, and he's a successful businessman. Asking for his advice isn't interference, it's smart resource utilization. I watched Tiffany struggle to defend a position that was becoming increasingly untenable. As Robbie applied logical analysis to their family dynamics, her arguments depended on emotional manipulation rather than factual accuracy, and Robbie was too intelligent to be swayed by emotional manipulation once he recognized it. Tiffany, I can see that you're upset about my job situation, but don't let this crisis destroy our marriage. We can work through these problems together. Tiffany, I'm not upset about your job situation. I'm upset about your dishonesty about your job situation. I'm upset about the pattern of behavior that got you fired. And I'm upset about the way you've been systematically undermining my relationship with my father while lying about your own competence and success. I haven't been systematically undermining anything. Yes, you have. Every conversation about Dad's offers to help, you framed as him being controlling. Every piece of advice he gave that proved beneficial, you dismissed as luck or coincidence. Every time I wanted to spend time with him or ask for his opinion, you found reasons why that would be problematic for our marriage. Tiffany sat down her second beer and looked at Robbie with an expression that combined desperation with a dawning recognition that her usual tactics weren't working. Robbie, marriages require boundaries. I was trying to establish healthy boundaries between us and your father's tendency to insert himself into our decisions. Tiffany, Dad has never inserted himself into our decisions. I've invited his input on important choices because he's experienced, successful, and I trust his judgment. The fact that you experienced my relationship with my father as a threat to your authority in our marriage says more about your insecurities than it does about his behavior. The conversation was reaching a point where Tiffany would either need to acknowledge the accuracy of Robbie's analysis or escalate her defensive tactics. Based on what I'd observed about her character over the past 2 years, I suspected she would choose escalation. Robbie, if you choose your father's version of events over your wife's, you're basically ending our marriage. Tiffany, I'm not choosing anyone's version of events. I'm looking at documented evidence and recognizing patterns of behavior that I've been ignoring for months. Some ultimatums, I realized, reveal more about the person delivering them than the person receiving them. And some marriages reach moments where truth becomes incompatible with the foundations they've been built on. Tiffany was about to discover which category her marriage fell into. Robbie's response to Tiffany's ultimatum was immediate and decisive in a way that surprised even me. Tiffany, you're absolutely right. If I choose truth and documented evidence over your version of events, I am ending our marriage. So, let me be very clear. I choose truth. Tiffany's face went pale as she realized her manipulation tactic had backfired spectacularly. Robbie, that's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. You just gave me an ultimatum. Believe your lies or end our marriage. I'm choosing to end our marriage. I remained silent in my chair by the window, recognizing that Robbie had reached a conclusion that would reshape his entire life and that my role now was simply to provide support for whatever decisions he made. Tiffany, you're being irrational. You can't end a marriage because of one bad day at work. This isn't about one bad day at work, Tiffany. This is about 6 months of lies regarding your job performance, 2 years of systematic manipulation regarding my relationship with my father, and a pattern of disrespecting men that I've been ignoring because I wanted our marriage to succeed. Tiffany stood up and began pacing around their small living room, her agitation increasing as she realized that Robbie wasn't responding to her usual emotional manipulation tactics. You're letting your father poison your mind against me. Can't you see what he's doing? He fired me to break up our marriage because he's never approved of me. Tiffany, Dad didn't need to break up our marriage. You've been undermining it yourself for months with dishonesty and manipulation. He just provided clarity about your character that I should have recognized earlier. Tiffany, please, we can work through these problems. I'll find another job. I'll be more honest about work situations. I'll try to get along better with your father. Tiffany, you fundamentally don't respect men in positions of authority or independence. That's not something you fix with promises to try harder. That's a core character issue that affects how you treat me, how you treat my father, how you treat male colleagues and customers. Robbie sat back down at the dining table and looked at Tiffany with the kind of analytical attention he'd always applied to important business problems. Let me ask you something, Tiffany. In the past 2 years, can you think of a single time when you deferred to my expertise or judgment on an important decision? Tiffany's silence stretched long enough to provide Robbie with his answer. Can you think of a single time when you acknowledged that Dad's advice or assistance was valuable without first expressing resentment about his interference in our decisions? More silence. Can you think of a single male colleague or customer whose professional competence you've respected without qualification or condescension? Tiffany, you're asking loaded questions. I'm asking simple questions about respect and recognition of male competence. The fact that you consider them loaded suggests that honest answers would be uncomfortable for you. I watched Tiffany realize that she was trapped in a conversation where her actual attitudes and behaviors were being examined systematically without the emotional manipulation and deflection tactics she usually relied on to avoid accountability. Tiffany, if you divorce me over this, you'll regret it. You'll realize that I was trying to protect our marriage from your father's controlling influence, and by then it will be too late to repair the damage. Tiffany, I'm not going to regret choosing honesty over manipulation, independence over control, or family relationships based on mutual respect over relationships based on isolation and resentment. You think your father respects you? He just demonstrated that he's willing to destroy your wife's career to get revenge for a family disagreement. Robbie looked at Tiffany with something that might have been pity. Tiffany, Dad didn't destroy your career to get revenge. He terminated an employee who was failing professionally and behaving inappropriately toward men. The fact that the employee happened to be his daughter-in-law probably made the decision more difficult, not easier. That's not how he saw it. How do you know how he saw it? You spent 2 years assuming the worst possible motivations for everything Dad does, while consistently lying about your own behavior and performance. Tiffany sat down heavily on their couch, apparently realizing that her marriage was ending and that none of her usual tactics were effective in this conversation. Tiffany, what do you want from me? An apology? Acknowledgement that I made mistakes? A promise to change my behavior? I want you to understand why your apologies and promises aren't sufficient. Tiffany, you've demonstrated fundamental disrespect for men's intelligence and autonomy. You've lied consistently about important matters. You've systematically undermined my relationships with people who care about me. Those aren't mistakes you fix with apologies. Those are character issues that would require years of genuine change. So, you're giving up on our marriage without giving me a chance to change? Robbie was quiet for several minutes, considering Tiffany's question with the careful thought he'd always applied to major decisions. Tiffany, I gave you 2 years to change patterns of behavior that I kept hoping were temporary or situational. I made excuses for your attitudes toward Dad, rationalized your resentment of his success, and convinced myself that your need to be the dominant voice in our relationship was about healthy boundaries rather than control. Robbie, marriage requires compromises. Marriage requires mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to each other's growth and happiness. Tiffany, you've spent 2 years prioritizing your ego over my relationships, your comfort over truthful communication, and your need for control over our partnership. I've never tried to control you. You've tried to control who I can ask for advice, who I can accept help from, and how I should interpret the motivations of people who care about me. Tiffany, that's a form of emotional control that I'm no longer willing to tolerate. I felt a surge of pride watching Robbie articulate boundaries and standards that would serve him well in any future relationships. Tiffany's manipulation had been subtle and persistent, but Robbie was intelligent enough to recognize the patterns once he was able to see them clearly. So, what happens now? Tiffany asked, her voice defeated. Now you move out. I'll file for divorce. We will divide our assets according to the law, and I'll rebuild my life with honesty and relationships based on mutual respect rather than control and manipulation. Tiffany, you're making a huge mistake. You'll realize that I was the best thing that ever happened to you. Robbie stood up and walked to the front door, opening it in a clear signal that this conversation was concluded. Tiffany, the best thing that ever happened to me was learning to recognize the difference between love and manipulation, between support and control, between someone who values my judgment and someone who consistently undermines it. As Tiffany gathered some personal belongings and prepared to leave the house that would soon be solely Robbie's responsibility, I realized that my son had learned something valuable about the importance of choosing partners who enhanced rather than diminished his relationships with people he loved. Dad, Robbie said after Tiffany had left, I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than yesterday's group chat. I've been allowing Tiffany to convince me that your success and independence were somehow threatening to my marriage instead of assets that I should have appreciated. Some apologies, I was learning, weren't necessary between people who loved each other unconditionally, and some sons were strong enough to choose difficult truths over comfortable lies when their integrity demanded it. Tomorrow, Robbie would begin rebuilding his life with the wisdom that came from recognizing manipulation before it could do permanent damage. Tonight, we would plan his future with the clarity that came from choosing family relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear and control. 3 days after Tiffany moved out, Robbie and I were sitting in my home office discussing the practical aspects of his divorce when my assistant Sam called with news that added an interesting wrinkle to our situation. Mr. Hayes, I've received several phone calls today from employees at Thompson Auto Group. Apparently, Tiffany Thompson has been contacting former colleagues and making claims about wrongful termination and workplace retaliation. What kind of claims, Sam? She's telling people that you fired her because she wouldn't allow you to control his marriage, and she's suggesting that other employees should be concerned about job security if they have any family connections to company ownership. I put the call on speaker so Robbie could hear the conversation. Sam, have any employees expressed actual concerns about their job security? No, quite the opposite. Several people have mentioned that Tiffany's termination has improved workplace morale significantly. Apparently, her behavior toward male colleagues had been a source of ongoing tension that people were afraid to report formally. Robbie looked at me with raised eyebrows. Tiffany was creating problems for other employees too. Apparently so. Sam, what kind of feedback are you getting about Tiffany's allegations? Most people are expressing relief that she's no longer with the company. Jennifer Martinez from the accounting department specifically asked me to thank you for finally addressing the Tiffany Thompson problem that had been making several men uncomfortable for months. After ending the call, Robbie sat back in his chair with the expression of someone whose understanding of his marriage was continuing to evolve. Dad, I'm starting to realize that Tiffany's issues with men weren't limited to our family dynamics. She had problems respecting men in general, and I somehow convinced myself that her specific issues with you were about family boundaries rather than fundamental attitudes. Robbie, manipulative people are often very skilled at compartmentalizing their behavior and making their victims feel like isolated incidents rather than part of larger patterns. But I should have recognized the patterns. The way she dismissed my professional opinions, the way she reacted to male authority figures, the way she consistently assumed that men were less capable of handling complex decisions. I leaned forward across my desk, recognizing that Robbie was processing guilt about missing warning signs that might have been clearer in hindsight. Robbie, Tiffany was subtle and strategic about her manipulation. She made you feel like you were being overly sensitive or misinterpreting her behavior when you noticed problems. That's a classic tactic of emotionally manipulative people. I just feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. You feel stupid because Tiffany spent 2 years convincing you that your perceptions were unreliable and your instincts were wrong. Robbie, that's not a reflection of your intelligence. It's evidence of her skill at psychological manipulation. My phone rang again, this time with an unknown number that I answered cautiously. Mr. Hayes, this is Derek Thompson Sr., Tiffany Thompson's father. I need to speak with you about the terrible injustice you've done to my daughter. I gestured for Robbie to remain quiet while putting the call on speaker. Mr. Thompson, I'm not sure what Tiffany has told you about her employment termination, but I can only discuss documented performance issues and company policies. Tiffany told me that you fired her because you're angry about family disagreements and that you're trying to destroy her marriage to Robbie. That's completely inappropriate and probably illegal. Mr. Thompson, Tiffany was terminated for documented poor performance, customer complaints, and violation of company policies regarding professional behavior. Her termination had nothing to do with family relationships. That's not what Tiffany said. She said, "You've been planning this revenge ever since you bought the company." Robbie gestured that he wanted to speak, and I nodded. Mr. Thompson, this is Robbie. I was present when Dad explained Tiffany's termination, and I read all the performance documentation. Tiffany has been lying to me about her job performance for 6 months while failing consistently at work. Robbie, son, you're letting your father manipulate you against your own wife. Tiffany loves you and has been trying to protect your marriage from his controlling behavior. Mr. Thompson, Tiffany has been controlling my behavior by convincing me that my father's support was actually interference. I've realized that she systematically undermined my relationship with Dad because she felt threatened by his success and independence. There was a long pause before Mr. Thompson responded, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Robbie, Tiffany is a good woman who's been treated unfairly by a vindictive man who can't accept that his son has his own life now. Mr. Thompson, I interjected, Tiffany is welcome to pursue legal action if she believes her termination was inappropriate. However, I'm confident that any investigation will confirm that her firing was based solely on work performance and professional conduct issues. We'll see about that. Tiffany has contacted an employment attorney, and we're exploring all options for holding you accountable for this vindictive behavior. After Mr. Thompson hung up, Robbie looked at me with a mixture of frustration and recognition. Dad, that conversation just clarified something important about Tiffany's family dynamics. Her father automatically assumed that any consequences Tiffany faced were someone else's fault, that any man in authority was being vindictive, and that Tiffany's version of events was automatically accurate. What does that tell you about Tiffany's upbringing and assumptions about accountability? That she was raised to believe that her failures were always someone else's responsibility, especially when that someone else was a man. Robbie paused, processing this insight. No wonder she couldn't accept that her job performance was her own fault. No wonder she assumed that your success was somehow threatening rather than admirable. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Eli, this isn't over. You'll regret destroying my career and my marriage. Some people fight back when powerful men abuse their positions. I showed the message to Robbie, who read it with growing alarm. Dad, is that a threat? Should we contact the police? It's borderline threatening, but not specific enough to constitute a legal threat. However, I am going to document it and forward it to our legal department in case Tiffany's behavior escalates. Do you think she might actually try to cause problems for you professionally? I think Tiffany is discovering that actions have consequences, and people who aren't used to facing consequences sometimes react unpredictably when their manipulation tactics fail. That evening, Robbie and I were reviewing his divorce paperwork when my security system alerted me to movement in my driveway. Looking out the window, I could see Tiffany's car parked outside my house with Tiffany herself standing on my front porch. Robbie, Tiffany is here. Do you want to talk to her? Not particularly. What does she want? The doorbell rang insistently, followed by loud knocking. Eli, I know you're in there. We need to settle this situation before it gets out of hand. I considered ignoring Tiffany entirely, but her agitation was clearly escalating, and I preferred to address whatever grievance she had while Robbie was present as a witness. Tiffany, what do you want? I called through the door without opening it. I want to make a deal. You give me my job back with a clean employment record, and I'll stop telling people about your vindictive abuse of power. Robbie looked at me with disbelief. She's trying to blackmail you. Tiffany, your employment was terminated for legitimate performance and conduct reasons. There won't be any deals or negotiations about that decision. Eli, you don't understand the damage this is causing. I have a husband to support, bills to pay, a reputation to maintain. You can't destroy people's lives because of personal grudges. Tiffany, you destroyed your own professional reputation through documented poor performance. You're destroying your own marriage through dishonesty and manipulation. And you're destroying your own credibility by attempting to blackmail your former employer. The knocking became more insistent, and Tiffany's voice grew louder. This isn't over, Eli. People like you think you can use your money and power to control other people's lives, but there are consequences for that behavior. I called the police while Tiffany continued her increasingly agitated monologue from my front porch. Some women, I was learning, responded to accountability by escalating their inappropriate behavior rather than examining their own choices, and some situations required professional intervention to ensure that consequences remained proportional to the actions that created them. Tiffany Thompson was about to discover that intimidation tactics were considerably less effective than taking responsibility for her own failures. The police arrived within 15 minutes of my call, by which time Tiffany had escalated from knocking on my door to walking around my house, peering through windows and shouting accusations about powerful men who destroy women's careers for sport. Officers Martinez and Johnson approached Tiffany with professional calm while I explained the situation from inside my house. Ma'am, we've received a complaint about disturbing the peace and potential harassment. Do you live at this address? No, but this man has destroyed my life and my marriage, and he needs to understand that his actions have consequences. Through my window, I watched Officer Martinez exchange glances with his partner as Tiffany's agitation became increasingly obvious. Ma'am, what's your relationship to the homeowner? He's my father-in-law, and he fired me from my job because I wouldn't let him control my marriage. He's abusing his power as a business owner to get revenge on family members. Ma'am, employment disputes are civil matters, not criminal ones. You can't address workplace issues by coming to someone's private residence and causing a disturbance. This isn't just a workplace issue. He's systematically destroying my life. Robbie appeared beside me at the window, watching his estranged wife argue with police officers about her right to intimidate me at my own home. Dad, she's completely lost perspective. She genuinely believes that facing consequences for her actions means she's being victimized. Officer Johnson approached my front door while his partner continued speaking with Tiffany near the street. Sir, I'm Officer Johnson. Can you explain your relationship with the individual in your driveway and the nature of the dispute? I opened the door and provided a concise summary of Tiffany's employment termination, her subsequent attempts at intimidation, and her current escalation to harassment at my private residence. Has she made any specific threats against you or your property? She sent a text message saying that I'd regret my actions and that some people fight back when powerful men abuse their positions. Tonight, she's saying that my actions will have consequences and that I need to understand the damage I'm causing. May I see the text message? I showed Officer Johnson Tiffany's message, which he photographed for documentation purposes. Sir, while these statements are concerning, they're not specific enough to constitute legal threats. However, her presence at your residence after you've asked her to leave does constitute harassment. What are my options? We can issue a warning about harassment and disturbing the peace. If she returns to your property or continues attempting to contact you, You can file for a restraining order based on a pattern of harassment. Robbie joined our conversation at the front door. Officer, Tiffany is my wife, and we're currently separated. I don't want him to have any legal justification for claiming that Dad is preventing him from contacting me. Sir, are you residing here currently? Temporarily, while I'm filing for divorce and making other living arrangements. Officer Johnson consulted with his partner, then returned to explain Tiffany's options and consequences. Ma'am, you're being issued a warning for harassment and disturbing the peace. You're required to leave this property immediately and not return without explicit permission from the homeowner. Any future contact with Mr. Hayes should be conducted through appropriate legal channels if you have legitimate business disputes. This is ridiculous. I'm being treated like a criminal for trying to address the destruction of my career and marriage. Ma'am, if you have legitimate legal grievances, there are appropriate venues for addressing them. Showing up at someone's private residence and creating disturbances is not one of those venues. Tiffany looked toward the house where Robbie and I were standing in the doorway, her expression cycling through anger, desperation, and what might have been genuine confusion about why her intimidation tactics weren't producing the results she expected. Robbie, please don't let your father destroy our marriage. We can work through these problems if you'll just think independently instead of letting him manipulate your decisions. Tiffany, I am thinking independently. That's why I'm divorcing you. You're making a terrible mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life. Tiffany, the only mistake I'm regretting is not recognizing your manipulation tactics sooner. After the police left and Tiffany reluctantly departed, Robbie and I sat in my living room discussing the escalation of Tiffany's behavior and what it revealed about her character under pressure. Dad, I've never seen Tiffany lose control like that before. In 2 years of marriage, she was always calculating and strategic about her arguments and manipulation. Tonight, she seemed genuinely unhinged. Robbie, some people maintain their composure only as long as their tactics are working. When manipulation fails and accountability becomes unavoidable, their true character emerges. I'm starting to realize that Tiffany's entire approach to our relationship was strategic rather than emotional. She wasn't loving me. She was managing me. I felt sad for Robbie as he processed the recognition that his marriage had been built on manipulation rather than genuine partnership. But I was also proud of his clarity and strength in facing difficult truths. Robbie, what are you learning about yourself through this experience? I'm learning that I'm stronger than I thought, smarter than Tiffany gave me credit for, and more capable of independent judgment than she wanted me to believe. Robbie paused, considering his words carefully. I'm also learning that I inherited more of your business instincts than I realized. What do you mean? Tiffany spent 2 years convincing me that seeking advice from successful people was weakness, that accepting help from family was dependence, and that trusting my own judgment was arrogance. But Dad, those are exactly the attitudes that would prevent someone from building a successful career or business. You're recognizing that Tiffany's advice was designed to limit your potential rather than develop it. Exactly. She didn't want a strong, independent husband who might outgrow her. She wanted a dependent husband who would validate her need to be the dominant partner in our relationship. My phone buzzed with an email from my attorney forwarding a legal notice that Tiffany's employment lawyer had sent regarding her wrongful termination case. Robbie, Tiffany has officially filed a wrongful termination claim. Her attorney is alleging that I fired her for personal reasons unrelated to job performance. Will that be a problem? Not based on the documentation we have. Tiffany's employment file contains 6 months of performance reviews, customer complaints, and incident reports that clearly justify termination. Her attorney will discover that this case has no merit once they review the actual evidence. What if Tiffany tries to argue that you bought the company specifically to have power over her? Robbie, I bought Thompson Auto Group in March, and Tiffany wasn't hired until June. The timeline doesn't support her conspiracy theory, and the business records will prove that the acquisition was based on financial opportunity rather than personal vendetta. That evening, as Robbie settled into the guest room that was becoming his temporary residence during the divorce proceedings, I reflected on how Tiffany's escalating behavior was actually providing valuable clarity about the dynamics of their marriage. Dad, Robbie called from the hallway, I want you to know that I'm grateful Tiffany showed her true character before we had children together. I can't imagine trying to co-parent with someone who reacts to accountability by blaming everyone else and escalating to intimidation tactics. Robbie, you're going to emerge from this situation stronger, wiser, and better equipped to recognize healthy relationship dynamics in the future. I hope so, And Dad, I want to work for Hayes Enterprises if you think I could contribute meaningfully to your business. I felt a surge of pride and excitement at Robbie's offer, recognizing that he was choosing to build his future around competence, integrity, and family relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. Robbie, I would be honored to have you join the company, but only if you're choosing that path for your own professional development, not just as a reaction to Tiffany's failures. I'm choosing it because I want to learn from someone I respect, work in an environment that values competence over politics, and build a career that Tiffany would never be able to undermine or control. Some divorces, I was learning, weren't just endings of unsuccessful marriages. They were beginnings of stronger, more authentic versions of the people who'd been diminished by manipulation and control. And some sons discovered their own potential when they were no longer being managed by partners who preferred dependence to independence. 6 months after Tiffany's termination and subsequent harassment incident, Robbie and I were reviewing quarterly reports for Hayes Enterprises when Sam knocked on my office door with news that would bring our Tiffany Thompson chapter to its final conclusion. Mr. Hayes, I have some interesting updates on Miss Thompson's legal proceedings. Her wrongful termination lawsuit has been dismissed, and there are some additional developments you should know about. Come in, Sam. What kind of additional developments? Sam settled into the chair across from my desk, consulting her notes with the satisfied expression of someone delivering long-awaited justice. First, Miss Thompson's employment attorney withdrew from the case after reviewing the documentation we provided. Apparently, 6 months of performance reviews, customer complaints, and incident reports made it clear that the termination was not only justified, but probably overdue. Robbie looked up from his laptop, where he'd been analyzing market trends for our latest acquisition. Did Tiffany's attorney give any specific reasons for withdrawing? According to the withdrawal letter, the attorney stated that after reviewing all evidence, they could not in good conscience continue representing a client whose claims were demonstrably false and potentially frivolous. I felt a sense of professional vindication that had nothing to do with personal satisfaction and everything to do with the importance of maintaining high employment standards in our company. Sam, what about Tiffany's attempts to file complaints with the Labor Board and Employment Commission? All dismissed for lack of merit. The investigators found that Thompson Auto Group maintained excellent documentation of Miss Thompson's performance issues and followed all appropriate procedures for progressive discipline and termination. And the harassment charges Robbie and I filed? That's where it gets interesting. During the investigation of Miss Thompson's behavior, the police discovered that she'd been engaging in similar intimidation tactics with other people who she felt had wronged her. Robbie sat down his coffee cup, giving Sam his full attention. What kind of other people? Her previous employer, where she was apparently terminated for similar performance issues, a male supervisor at a job before that who had documented her inappropriate workplace behavior, even her apartment complex manager, who had received complaints about Miss Thompson's aggressive responses to routine maintenance requests. I realized that Tiffany's escalation of inappropriate behavior represented a pattern that extended far beyond our family situation. Sam, what does this mean legally? It means Miss Thompson has been charged with multiple counts of harassment and stalking, and she's facing potential jail time if convicted. More importantly, for our purposes, it completely undermines any credibility she might have had in claiming that her termination was retaliatory rather than performance-based. Robbie was quiet for several minutes, processing the recognition that Tiffany's behavior toward me and Thompson Auto Group represented just one example of a broader pattern of inability to accept accountability or handle professional criticism appropriately. Dad, I'm realizing that Tiffany probably would have escalated her controlling behavior in our marriage even if the job termination hadn't happened. This pattern suggests she had fundamental problems with authority and accountability that would have affected our relationship eventually. Robbie, what you're recognizing is that Tiffany's issues weren't specifically about me or about our family dynamics. They were about her inability to function appropriately in any situation where her behavior had consequences. Sam continued with her updates. There's one more development that I think you'll find satisfying. Thompson Auto Group's performance has improved dramatically since Miss Thompson's termination. Sales are up 37%. Customer satisfaction ratings have increased significantly. And several male employees have mentioned that the workplace culture is much more comfortable and professional. That confirms that Tiffany's impact on the company was negative in ways that extended beyond her individual performance metrics. Exactly. And Mr. Hayes, The other sales team members have specifically mentioned that they feel more confident approaching male customers now that they don't have to worry about Miss Thompson undermining their professional interactions with inappropriate comments or behavior. Robbie looked at me with an expression that combined relief with sadness. Dad, Tiffany didn't just damage our marriage and her own career. She was actively making things worse for other people who were just trying to do their jobs professionally. Robbie, that's often how manipulative behavior works. It creates negative ripple effects that extend far beyond the primary targets of the manipulation. After Sam left to continue coordinating Tiffany's legal consequences, Robbie and I spent the afternoon discussing how his first 6 months at Hayes Enterprises had exceeded both our expectations for his professional development. Robbie, your analysis of the Henderson Group acquisition was exceptional. You identified market opportunities and potential risks that I hadn't fully considered. Thank you, Dad. I'm discovering that I have business instincts that I never developed while I was married to Tiffany. Probably because she consistently discouraged me from trusting my own judgment about complex decisions. What are you learning about yourself professionally? That I'm much more capable of strategic thinking and leadership than Tiffany wanted me to believe. She spent 2 years convincing me that my ideas were naive or impractical, when in reality, my instincts about business and people are pretty solid. I felt proud watching Robbie flourish in an environment that challenged his abilities, rather than diminishing them, and grateful that Tiffany's inappropriate behavior had been stopped before it could damage more people's professional and personal lives. Robbie, I want to discuss something important with you. I've been considering expanding Hayes Enterprises into consulting services for minority-owned businesses, and I'd like you to head that division, if you're interested. Really? You think I'm ready for that kind of responsibility? I think you have exactly the combination of business acumen, interpersonal skills, and understanding of gender dynamics that would make you excellent at helping other men build successful enterprises. Robbie was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him processing the magnitude of what I was proposing. Not just a job opportunity, but a chance to build something meaningful that would help other men achieve professional success. Dad, I would love to head that division. And you know what? I want to specifically focus on helping men who are rebuilding their careers after leaving manipulative relationships. Men who've been convinced that they're not capable of independent success and need to rediscover their own competence and confidence. That's a brilliant focus. Robbie, you understand that demographic from personal experience, and your success in rebuilding your own life would provide credibility and inspiration for other men facing similar challenges. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Eli, I want you to know that I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm working on becoming a better person. I hope someday you and Robbie can forgive me for the damage I caused. Tiffany. I showed the message to Robbie, who read it with a mixture of skepticism and what might have been cautious hope. Robbie, what do you think about Tiffany's apology? I think it sounds more genuine than her previous attempts to manipulate the situation. But, Dad, forgiveness isn't about Tiffany's words. It's about whether she actually changes her behavior long term. And regardless of whether Tiffany changes, you've already moved beyond being affected by her choices. Exactly. Tiffany's growth or lack of growth is her responsibility. My growth and success are mine. That evening, as Robbie and I finalized the business plan for our new consulting division, I reflected on how Tiffany's manipulation and harassment had ultimately led to opportunities and insights that neither Robbie nor I would have developed without being forced to confront her behavior directly. Robbie, what would you tell other men who are married to women like Tiffany, but haven't recognized the manipulation patterns yet? I'd tell them to trust their instincts about family, relationships, and professional opportunities. If someone consistently discourages you from seeking advice from successful people, accepting help from family, or trusting your own judgment about important decisions, those are red flags that should be investigated rather than ignored. Some lessons, I was learning, were valuable enough to share with other men who might benefit from our experience with manipulation, accountability, and the importance of choosing relationships that enhanced rather than diminished personal and professional growth. And some sons developed into exceptional business leaders when they were finally free to explore their potential, without interference from partners who preferred dependence to independence. 2 years after Tiffany's termination and the dissolution of Robbie's marriage, I stood at the podium of the Downtown Business Center's main conference hall, looking out at an audience of 300 men who had gathered for the inaugural Hayes Enterprises Men's Leadership Summit. Robbie sat in the front row. His role as Director of Business Development having exceeded every expectation I'd had when we first discussed his joining the company. Gentlemen, when I started Hayes Enterprises 15 years ago, I never imagined that one of our most successful divisions would be built from the lessons my son and I learned about recognizing and recovering from manipulative relationships. I began, noting the attentive expressions of men, ranging from their 20 seconds to their 60 seconds. But sometimes our most valuable professional insights come from our most challenging personal experiences, especially when those experiences teach us about the difference between support and control, between partnership and manipulation, between love and management. The audience included CEOs, entrepreneurs, recent graduates, and men who were rebuilding their careers after divorce or other major life transitions. Many of them had worked with Robbie's consulting division over the past 18 months, and their success stories had become the foundation for today's summit. 2 years ago, my daughter-in-law sent a message in our family group chat, saying, "Don't come to the cookout. You'll just bring down the vibe, honestly." My son and her parents liked that message, publicly endorsing her assessment that I was a mood-ruining inconvenience. A murmur of recognition and sympathy rippled through the audience. Many of these men had experienced similar dismissals from family members who felt threatened by their success or independence. I responded with 4 words: "Understood. Enjoy your cookout." But what Tiffany Thompson didn't understand was that she just publicly humiliated her employer because 6 months earlier I had quietly acquired the failing automotive dealership where she worked. The audience's attention sharpened as they realized this was going to be a story about accountability rather than victimization. When Tiffany and Robbie came to her workplace the next morning for what she thought was a routine meeting with management, they discovered me sitting behind the CEO's desk with 6 months of documentation, showing that Tiffany had been failing consistently while lying to Robbie about her job performance. I paused, allowing the audience to process the implications of personal behavior intersecting with professional consequences. Tiffany was terminated that day, not because she'd hurt my feelings at a family cookout, but because she demonstrated a pattern of poor performance, customer complaints, and inappropriate behavior toward men that made her unsuitable for continued employment. Robbie joined me at the podium, his confidence and poise reflecting the growth he'd experienced through rebuilding his life and career on foundations of honesty and mutual respect. 2 years ago, I was married to a woman who spent our entire relationship convincing me that my father's success was threatening, that seeking advice from accomplished people was weakness, and that trusting my own judgment about important decisions was arrogance, Robbie said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned valuable lessons through direct experience. I made excuses for Tiffany's behavior, rationalized her attitudes, and convinced myself that her need to be the dominant voice in our relationship was about healthy boundaries rather than control and manipulation. What I learned through Tiffany's professional failure and subsequent harassment was that manipulative people don't just target their romantic partners. They create problems for colleagues, customers, employers, and anyone else who expects them to be accountable for their behavior and performance. I returned to the microphone. Tiffany's story illustrates something crucial about workplace culture and business leadership. People who can't respect men in their personal lives typically can't respect men in professional settings either. Their attitudes create toxic environments that damage team morale, customer relationships, and company reputation. That's why Robbie's division focuses specifically on helping men recognize and address these patterns, both in their personal relationships and their professional environments. Robbie stepped forward again. Our consulting services have helped over 150 men in the past 18 months. But we've also worked with corporations to identify and eliminate workplace cultures that tolerate disrespectful behavior toward men in leadership positions. Because what we learned through my personal experience is that Tiffany's attitudes weren't unique. They were representative of broader cultural assumptions about male authority and competence that affect businesses, families, and communities. Dr. Patricia Williams, a workplace psychology expert who'd partnered with Robbie's division, joined us at the podium to present research findings from companies that had implemented our recommended policy changes. Organizations that adopted Hayes Enterprises' recommendations for identifying and addressing gender-based workplace disrespect reported average increases of 42% in male employee retention, 37% improvement in customer satisfaction ratings from male clients, and 28% increases in overall team productivity. These improvements weren't achieved through complex diversity initiatives or expensive training programs. They were achieved by establishing clear consequences for behavior that undermines professional respect, and by creating environments where competence and character determine advancement rather than gender or family connections. During the afternoon workshop sessions, I had the opportunity to speak with individual attendees about their experiences with manipulation in both personal and professional contexts. The stories were remarkably consistent. Men who'd been convinced that their instincts were unreliable, their ambitions were inappropriate, and their successes were threatening to the women in their lives. "Mr. Hayes," said Jeremy Torres, a 3-4-year-old marketing executive, "your story helped me recognize that my ex-wife's constant criticism of my career achievements wasn't about our relationship. It was about her insecurity about my independence. I've been promoted twice since our divorce. What changed in your approach to work after the divorce?" I stopped second-guessing my professional instincts and seeking permission for decisions I was qualified to make independently. My ex-wife had convinced me that assertiveness in men was off-putting, but my colleagues and clients actually respect direct communication and confident decision-making. Similar conversations happened throughout the day, with men sharing stories of professional growth that had accelerated once they were no longer being managed by partners who preferred dependence to independence. During the closing session, Robbie presented our expansion plans for the next 2 years. Hayes Enterprises' Business Development Division will be opening offices in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville, providing consulting services and business development resources to men throughout the Southeast, Robbie announced to enthusiastic applause. We'll also be launching a mentorship program that connects successful men entrepreneurs with those who are rebuilding their careers after major life transitions, particularly divorce from manipulative relationships. Because what we've learned is that personal growth and professional success are deeply connected. And men who learn to recognize manipulation in one area of their lives become more effective at creating healthy boundaries in all areas of their lives. As the summit concluded and attendees networked over dinner, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought Robbie and me to this point. Tiffany's manipulation and harassment had been painful and disruptive, but they had also revealed strengths and opportunities that might never have been developed under more comfortable circumstances. "Dad," Robbie said, joining me on the conference center's outdoor terrace where I'd stepped away from the networking dinner, "I received an interesting email today. Tiffany's gotten engaged to someone named Leo, and he apparently contacted me through LinkedIn asking about what it was really like being married to Tiffany." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that Tiffany had fundamental issues with respecting men's independence and competence, that she'd systematically undermined my relationship with family members who supported my career, and that she'd been terminated from her job for inappropriate behavior toward male colleagues and customers." "How did he respond?" "He thanked me for my honesty and said he'd been noticing concerning patterns in Tiffany's behavior, but had been convinced by her that her previous relationships had failed because the men were too influenced by traditional ideas about dependence." I felt a mixture of sadness for Tiffany's apparent inability to change and hoped that her new boyfriend would have the wisdom to protect himself from manipulation that Robbie had learned to recognize and reject. "Robbie, what do you think about Tiffany's engagement?" "I think it confirms that Tiffany hasn't learned to address the character issues that destroyed our marriage and her professional reputation. But I also think that's no longer my concern or responsibility." As we drove home from the summit, Robbie asked the question that had been building throughout the day's presentations and conversations. "Dad, do you think we would have developed this consulting division if Tiffany hadn't behaved so inappropriately? Would we have discovered these insights about manipulation and business culture without going through that experience ourselves? I think we would have been successful in different ways. But Robbie, experiencing Tiffany's manipulation and learning to overcome it gave us credibility and insight that men facing similar challenges can trust and relate to. So, in a strange way, Tiffany's worst behavior led to our best professional opportunities. Tiffany's worst behavior led to our clearest understanding of our own strengths and our strongest commitment to helping other men develop similar strength and clarity. My daughter-in-law thought that humiliating a father-in-law would be without consequences. She discovered that some fathers-in-law are CEOs who don't tolerate employees who disrespect men, especially when those men are themselves. But more importantly, she taught my son and me that our greatest professional purposes could be built from our most difficult personal experiences, as long as we chose growth over victimization and service over resentment. As Robbie and I planned the next phase of our business expansion, I realized that some betrayals became the foundations for enterprises larger and more meaningful than the people who'd committed them ever imagined possible. Some sons discovered their greatest potential when they were finally free from partners who preferred management to partnership. And some fathers-in-law learned that the most satisfying revenge was building something valuable from the wreckage that manipulative people created when they underestimated the men they tried to control. Tiffany Thompson had intended to diminish me. Instead, she had accidentally inspired Robbie and me to create resources that would protect and empower hundreds of other men from women exactly like her.